Imagine two of the world's most powerful leaders, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, meeting in the icy vastness of Alaska, far from the chaos of capitals and the noise of the media. To most people, it might seem like just another high-profile diplomatic spectacle, but for India, this meeting is far more than a distant headline. It's a potential turning point in the global order, one that could reshape defense strategies, energy markets, and the balance of power in Asia. India's interest isn't about choosing sides, it's about understanding how the moves made in that frozen room could ripple across the Indian Ocean, influence its military preparedness, and even alter its leverage against its most formidable neighbor, China. The Trump-Putin Summit is not simply a US-Russia affair. It's a geopolitical signal, and India is listening very closely. India's first and most immediate concern about the Trump-Putin Summit in Alaska lies in the realm of strategic security. While the optics of the meeting might be dominated by talks on nuclear arms control, Arctic resources, or US-Russia tensions, the subtext is about the shifting architecture of global alliances. Any rapprochement between Washington and Moscow has the potential to disrupt the delicate balance India has worked hard to maintain. For decades, India has relied on a nuanced foreign policy, one that kept strong defense ties with Russia while simultaneously cultivating strategic cooperation with the United States. If these two global powers decide to align more closely, the landscape changes. Suddenly, the unique leverage India enjoys with each may diminish, replaced by a new power equation where decisions are made in closed rooms far from New Delhi, with ripple effects that could reach the Himalayan border. In security terms, this is not a theoretical concern. India faces a two-front strategic challenge, China to the north and west, and Pakistan to the west, both with histories of conflict and both benefiting in different ways from Russian and American policies. If Washington and Moscow begin coordinating positions more tightly, especially on defense sales, arms control, or regional influence, India could find itself in a situation where both of its major defense partners are less flexible in accommodating its unique needs. Consider how crucial Russia has been as a supplier of advanced weapons systems like the S-400 and how important U.S. defense technology and intelligence sharing have become in countering China. A shift in the US-Russia dynamic could force India to adapt quickly, potentially at significant economic and strategic cost. There's also the psychological dimension to this concern. Geopolitics is not just about weapons and treaties, it's about perception and trust. If the US and Russia begin to see each other as cooperative rather than adversarial, India's negotiating position changes overnight, the assumption that each side might balance the other in dealings with India would no longer hold true. This means India would have to rethink its strategic autonomy, recalibrate its diplomatic engagement, and possibly double down on relationships with other global players like Japan, Australia, or the European Union. That is no small shift. It would require a reorientation of policy and public narrative, something that can be costly both politically and socially. And beyond strategy, there's the symbolic weight of the moment. For India, the Trump-Putin meeting is a reminder that in the global hierarchy of power, the major players often make moves without consulting those who will be affected. That is a sobering reality, but it's also a call to action. It's a prompt for India to strengthen its own voice on the world stage, to anticipate shifts rather than react to them, and to invest in the kind of domestic resilience that makes it less vulnerable to the decisions of others. If there's one takeaway here, it's that security in the modern world isn't guaranteed by borders or treaties alone. It's earned through foresight, flexibility, and the ability to remain indispensable even when the game changes. The economic dimension of India's interest in the Trump-Putin Summit in Alaska cannot be overstated. For decades, India has benefited from a predictable, if sometimes tense, alignment of global economic powers where Washington and Moscow's competition created openings for trade, investment, and resource access. When two such major powers edge toward closer cooperation, the world's financial and resource dynamics can shift dramatically, and India's economic calculus changes with them. At the heart of the concern is energy security. India is one of the world's largest importers of oil and gas, with Russia being a critical supplier. The U.S., while not a primary exporter to India, has influenced global energy prices through sanctions, trade policies, and its own production. If a U.S.-Russia thaw leads to ease sanctions on Russian energy exports, the immediate effect could be positive, more supply in the market, potentially lowering costs. But in the longer run, the geopolitical bargaining that accompanies such changes could narrow India's room to maneuver, especially if energy deals become tied to political alignment or diplomatic concessions. There's also the matter of trade routes and investment flows. The Arctic, which will undoubtedly be a topic at the summit, is rapidly becoming a focal point for global commerce. Melting ice is opening shorter shipping lanes, and Russia, with U.S. acknowledgement, could position itself as a gatekeeper for these routes. For India, this could mean a fundamental restructuring of global logistics networks, altering both the cost and security of its trade. More significantly, control over these routes translates into leverage that could be wielded in ways that either benefit or constrain India's economic aspirations. On a broader level, the philosophical concern is about dependency. The global economy is not a neutral playing field. It's shaped by alliances, rivalries, and the perception of reliability. If Washington and Moscow begin to coordinate their positions on key economic matters, it could reduce the diversity of partners India can turn to for favorable trade terms, investment, or technological collaboration. Economic sovereignty is not achieved by isolation, but by ensuring that no single bloc can dictate your terms. This is why any change in the U.S.-Russia dynamic reverberates through India's strategic economic thinking. The psychological impact on markets also matters. Investors, both foreign and domestic, respond as much to perception as to fact. A realignment between two nuclear-armed powers changes market sentiment, shifts investment priorities, and potentially redirects capital flows. If India is perceived as being on the periphery of this new alignment, it risks losing out on opportunities that are reallocated to nations seen as more directly aligned with the emerging U.S.-Russia understanding. That's not just about lost revenue, it's about losing influence in shaping the economic rules of the future. Ultimately, the summit's implications for India's economy are not just about numbers or trade volumes. They're about strategic positioning in a world where economic power is inseparable from political leverage. If India wants to safeguard its interests, it must treat this moment not as a spectator sport, but as a catalyst for diversifying partnerships, innovating domestically, and projecting economic strength with the same seriousness it applies to defense. In the end, nations that fail to anticipate the economic undercurrents of political shifts do not merely fall behind. They are swept aside. The defense and security dimension of India's interest in the Trump-Putin Summit reaches far beyond surface-level geopolitics. At its core, it's about the balance of power in a multipolar world, a balance that India has long relied on to navigate between major powers without becoming dependent on any single one. Historically, India's defense strategy has been built on a blend of self-reliance, selective imports, and diversified alliances. Russia has been a cornerstone supplier of advanced weaponry and technology, from fighter jets to missile systems, while the U.S. has, in recent decades, emerged as an increasingly important partner in intelligence sharing, joint exercises, and counterterrorism efforts. When Washington and Moscow appear to move closer together, this equilibrium risks disruption. If the summit results in a thaw between the two powers, it could alter the calculus of arms supply and defense cooperation in ways that directly affect India's readiness and autonomy. A U.S.-Russia understanding might bring opportunities, such as coordinated counterterrorism measures or shared stability in certain conflict zones. But it could also lead to constraints. For example, India's defense procurement often benefits from playing one supplier off the other, ensuring competitive pricing, favorable terms, and freedom from political strings. Should the U.S. and Russia begin to coordinate more closely, India might find itself facing more unified conditions, reducing its ability to negotiate independently. This shift also carries implications for India's strategic deterrence. The balance of power in Asia, especially with a rising China, depends not only on India's own capabilities, but also on the willingness of other major powers to maintain a certain level of competition with each other. If US-Russia cooperation diminishes the competitive tension, India could find itself with fewer external checks on China's ambitions, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. It's not just about the physical deployment of forces, it's about the psychological weight of knowing that two of the world's most powerful militaries might, in some scenarios, choose stability between themselves over maintaining leverage in regions where India's interests are at stake. Furthermore, military technology transfer and intelligence sharing are deeply tied to political trust. If Washington and Moscow create new channels of communication and joint security initiatives, India must consider whether sensitive defense agreements, especially with either power, could be subject to increased scrutiny or even shared indirectly with the other. That raises questions about the confidentiality of operations, the integrity of intelligence, and the strategic advantage India can maintain in an environment where the world's top military powers are talking to each other more than ever. In the realm of defense, complacency is not an option. Shifts in alliances happen subtly before they happen visibly, and by the time they are formalized, it is often too late to adjust without significant cost. India must view this summit as a warning to deepen indigenous defense production, diversify partnerships beyond the US and Russia, and assert itself as not merely a recipient of security arrangements, but as a shaper of them. The harsh truth is this: in global security, the power to act independently is never granted. It is built, guarded, and defended at all costs. The economic implications of the Trump-Putin Summit are not just about trade figures or bilateral deals. They're about the deeper, structural shifts in global economic governance that such a meeting could trigger. For India, this matters immensely because its rise as an emerging economic power has been shaped in an environment where major economies often counterbalance each other's influence in multilateral institutions. If the United States and Russia find common ground, particularly in energy markets, sanctions policy, or investment flows, it could lead to a reshaping of economic alliances that leaves less room for India to maneuver. Consider the energy sector, where both the US and Russia are dominant players. India, being one of the world's largest energy importers, benefits from a competitive global market in which multiple suppliers compete for contracts. If Washington and Moscow were to align policies or coordinate in energy pricing, whether explicitly or indirectly, it could narrow India's options, potentially increasing vulnerability to price shocks or geopolitical leverage. And in an interconnected economy, it's not only about oil and gas. Such cooperation could extend into rare earth minerals, nuclear technology, and even agricultural exports, creating ripple effects that reach deep into India's manufacturing and infrastructure development plans. There's also the question of sanctions regimes. Historically, US sanctions on Russia have indirectly benefited India by keeping Russian energy prices competitive and pushing Moscow to strengthen trade ties with New Delhi. A significant thaw could reverse that trend, reducing Russia's incentive to offer India favorable deals and possibly making certain technologies or partnerships more expensive or politically complicated to secure. The same applies in reverse. If a US-Russia understanding leads to coordinated sanctions against other nations, India might face greater pressure to align with positions that don't always serve its own economic interests. Then there's the broader matter of global economic institutions, the IMF, World Bank, WTO, where India often navigates by leveraging differences between the US, Russia, China, and the EU to build coalitions that protect the interests of developing nations. If Washington and Moscow start pushing a shared agenda, even in select economic forums, it could weaken the negotiating space available to India and other mid-tier powers. The philosophical truth here is that economic sovereignty is rarely about complete independence. It's about having multiple options, each with its own trade-offs. When those options shrink, power shifts away from the middle players toward the dominant ones. India's economic future hinges on maintaining flexibility in its partnerships, securing diverse sources of investment and technology, and ensuring that no two powers, whether allies or competitors, can dictate the terms of engagement unilaterally. The Trump-Putin Summit, while seemingly distant, is a reminder that in economics, as in geopolitics, the real battle is not fought on the stage of public diplomacy, but in the quiet, long-term shaping of systems, rules, and dependencies. The warning is clear: if you're not at the table, when these arrangements are made, you're probably on the menu.